Cantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Unsettled, Lord Selkirk's Scottish Colonists and the Battle for Canada's West, 1813 to 1816, by Robert Lauer. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Author's Note. This is a work of non-fiction, and as such I stand behind any and all statements and quotations, but it is not a history in any formal or academic sense. In the interest of smooth reading, I have kept citations to a minimum. Any quote without a citation comes straight from the Selkirk papers on microfilm in the archives of Manitoba. Because pre-Victorian sentence structure and vocabulary can be challenging, I have made alterations to spelling and punctuation in quotes where I believe it improves readability without altering meaning. When I have paraphrased, I've stayed as faithful to the documents as I can. The Selkirk papers are the chief archival source used for this book. Though I was always aware of the many other players involved, the point of view is unavoidably that of the Red River settlers, the Selkirk settlers. This is how they saw it, how my great-great-grandfather, a young millwright from Islay, must have seen it. Other points of view exist, and I have indicated them in places where contention persists. Caveat lector. Though my story is told through the eyes of the Scots who lived it, I am fully sensible of the social, cultural, economic, and physical crimes that the descendants of these settlers, right up to my own generation, have perpetrated on the original inhabitants of the Canadian prairies, and as one of those descendants, I accept my share of responsibility for that. As a son of the prairies, it would be hypocritical to say I wish that my forebears had never come, but I am heartily sorry, in the name of those forebears, for the suffering and injustices inflicted on First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. And for my own part I am sorry, I apologize, for the great part of my life that I spent accepting those same legal and social crimes as the inevitable, if regrettable, result of historical processes. They were not inevitable. We, the settlers, could have done so much better, but we frankly didn't care. In our, including my own, unquestioning belief in European entitlement, we were blind and deaf. I hope now that a corner has been turned, and that we have truly begun to care. Redress of grievances, recompense, and rehabilitation and recovery of stature and self-determination among indigenous cultures must be a national priority. The subjects of our story are Highland Scots, 250-plus men, women, and children, fleeing brutal displacement by another crime of humans against humans, the Highland clearances. Hindsight tells us that they were the vanguard of the coming invasion, but they did not know that, nor intend it. They knew only that they were being offered a way out of poverty and oppression. They had become refugees in their own country, and like refugees everywhere, they looked to distant lands for safe haven. That is the story I set out to tell, with all due respect, I hope, for those who were already here. A note on names. I have tried to identify First Nations by the names they use for themselves today, sometimes coupling them with the settler terms, many of which are still in common usage. For the Métis, I have used the name by which they referred to themselves at the time, Bois Brûlés, or just Brûlés. The term and spelling Métis came into common use in the years following the period covered by this book, and denotes a qualitative change in the way these unique people came to see themselves. As for individuals' names, it's a free-for-all, and anybody's guess which spelling is correct. You're on your own, except where I've made it clear why I am using a specific spelling. Finally, Scots names. MacDonald's, McDonald's, MacDonald's, McLeans, McLeods, Macbeaths, Macbeths, Mackays, and McRaes, not to mention the Alexanders, Archibalds, Anguses, Jameses, Jonathans, and Williams. The names can be dizzying in their similarity and repetition. It behooves the reader to pay close attention. Blame the Scots. I certainly do. This book was researched and written in the place where most of its events took place, in Winnipeg, near the forks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I hope it will play a small part in infusing real people and real life into this too often mechanical acknowledgment. This truly was, and remains, their native land. Robert Lauer, August 2022. Introduction. City on the Red. I was born, and have spent most of my life, in Winnipeg, as did my father before me. My city sits right at the center of southern Canada, astride the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, called locally the Forks, a continental crossroads and meeting place for peoples in every age since it emerged from the glacial meltwater some 8,000 years ago. Winnipeg is famous for its cold winters, its vibrant arts and music scene, its elm trees, Winnie the Pooh, the invention of the remote car starter, give that man a knighthood, and its history. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 shook the world, convincing every bloated capitalist and cozy politician in the British Empire and America that the Bolshevik Revolution had arrived on their doorstep. They used the army to crush it. The Métis Resistance, Red River Rebellion, of 1870 was the first concerted backlash from indigenous peoples against the wholesale Western expansion and land grab by settler Canada. Upon its suppression, also by an army, Winnipeg became the distribution and rail hub for that expansion and grew at such a rate that boosters thought it might rival Chicago. Virtually every immigrant, of the hundreds of thousands who answered the call to transform indigenous Buffalo Range into a vast wheat-producing machine, came through Winnipeg. Many went no further, including my family. History continues. As Canadians move forward with the difficult but necessary business of reconciliation between the settler population and the indigenous cultures we, displaced and damaged almost to destruction, Winnipeg's large concentration of First Nations families, along with its status as the homeland of the Métis Nation, put it right at the heart of that process. If reconciliation is to succeed at all, it must succeed here. The Promised Land. Before any of these, before there was a Winnipeg or a land rush or an entity called the Métis Nation, there was the Red River Settlement, a puny patch of ground occupied by a hopeful band of Scots refugees, never more than 150 at one time, looking only for a place to sow crops and sink roots. One of them was my great-great-grandfather, and that's what brought me to this story. As a child, I was familiar with the Selkirk settlers, as these uprooted Highlanders are called, and that an unspecified relative was one of them, but no story went along with that. Winnipeg and area abounded with their names, on streets, neighborhoods, parks, schools, and even a whole city, Selkirk. In school we heard about the Scottish Lord Selkirk and his attempts to help farmers of the Highlands displaced by callous landlords. We knew the names Miles MacDonell and something called the Pemmican War, disappointingly for little boys not really a war at all, which grew out of the bitter rivalry between two fur trade giants, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. But in the end, these were just facts, a series of incidents that had no power to fire the imagination, with one notable exception. Over the 3 years covered by this book, one event has remained alive and current through the generations, a clash now known simply as the Battle of Seven Oaks, but for over a century called by some, including the school system, the Seven Oaks Massacre, and by others La Grenouille, or its English translation, Frog Plain, referring to a campsite some distance from the battleground. This gunfight, which resulted in 22 deaths, has understandably stood out, both for its singular violence and for the division over its meaning. For my Scots forebears, it was a massacre of innocents who had done nothing wrong by uncivilized half-breeds, as they were called for far too long, out of some unfathomable primordial hatred. For Métis people, descendants of the other side of the field, it was a glorious victory over invaders who wanted to enslave them and destroy their way of life. For many on both sides of that divide, those opinions still prevail. Small wonder, then, that for most people curious about the Red River settlement, Seven Oaks is what they find and where they stop. To be clear, Seven Oaks was no part of why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I discovered the story that had been missing from those dry historical accounts, and that story makes Seven Oaks a far more interesting and complex event than its reduction to a fight between good guys and bad guys could ever convey. Some years ago I happened to see my great-great-grandfather's name, Samuel Lamont, on a bronze plaque in a Winnipeg park listing those first settlers of 1813. Having a name to go with that vague old family story, I went online. I discovered that Sam, a recently minted millwright, was 22 years old in 1813, and that as a well-regarded mechanic who knows his business, he had been hired to build a grist mill for the nascent colony. I went to the archives to dig a little deeper. The Selkirk papers comprise 20,000 pages, of which about 3,000 are the letters, reports, and journals written on the spot between 1812 and 1817 by the participants themselves. That's where I would find any reference to my ancestor. I dipped into the first journal at the point where Sam's group was making their way up the complicated river system between Hudson Bay and Lake Winnipeg. It instantly took my breath away, the immediacy and spontaneity of this optimistic record, written as the journey unfolded, without benefit of hindsight or reflection. It felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into a fog-filled canyon. Good heavens, I thought, these people have no idea what they are getting into. I knew, though, and was hooked. I stepped over the edge and into the future with them. I came to realize that previous researchers, however good their reporting on the events of these years, had, through choice or technical difficulty, missed or ignored the drama, the pulsing life, in this book. It is in the daily details, and above all the personalities, that the real story emerges. With a handful of exceptions, the settlers themselves, including my great-great-granddaddy, the millwright from Isla, do not speak in these documents, though they are often spoken about. The journals and letters are written by the men appointed by Lord Selkirk to conduct his settlers to his lands, and there to oversee his colony. Called officers or gentlemen, none of these men had ever been to western North America or seen the vast prairie at its heart. The settlers believed they were going to an unsettled, even unoccupied, tract of land belonging to his lordship, and therefore open to cultivation and settlement. In fact, a surprisingly large number of people already regarded the Forks as their home or territory. Most had never heard of Lord Selkirk, and the rest regarded him as an enemy, so the Highlanders' reception ranged from open-hearted welcome by First Nations bands to dangerous hostility as agents of the hated Hudson's Bay Company from the Northwest Company. It would be up to their officers to navigate this complicated landscape and find that sweet spot of mutual acceptance and accommodation that any meeting of nations requires. To this challenge they proved singularly unsuited. One decision at a time, a few Gaelic farmers from a remote Highland strath valley would be led to make history in the worst possible way. This is the story of how that unfolded. It is also something more, because this is where it all began. This is where a century and a half of commerce between indigenous plains people and Europeans began to turn from a trading relationship into an imperial acquisition, an extension of Britain, pushing aside and dispossessing the original peoples. In this story are the seeds of that one-sided catastrophe, and hints at how it all might have been done differently. Timeline. The broad outline of these years is well established, and it may well assist readers in keeping events and actors straight to provide a thumbnail summary here, a timeline of the principal events of these 3 desperate years. If you are already familiar with it, or if you would rather discover it as you read, you may want to skip the next 11 paragraphs. For the rest, here is a capsule account of the events covered in this book, so you may know just where you are. 1810. Lord Selkirk, who has already sponsored settlement schemes in Prince Edward Island and Upper Canada, decides his next colonization exercise will be in the extremely remote valley of the Red River, in what is now southern Manitoba, Canada, a place the Earl himself has never seen. To that end, he has bought a large stake in the vast fur-trading empire of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, whose charter gives them a monopoly on trade and colonization. 1811. Lord Selkirk acquires the colonization rights to a significant piece of territory, including the valley of the Red River. He sends an advance party under Captain Miles MacDonald to prepare the site. In 1812, he sends a few adventurous farmers to test the waters. 1813. The first full contingent of migrants, almost 100 Highland men, women, and children, is dispatched from Scotland to York Factory, the Hudson's Bay Company post at the mouth of the Nelson River, thence to be ferried by open boats to their destination 1,200 kilometers inland. A typhus outbreak on the ship leads to their being put ashore at the lesser post of Churchill, 250 kilometers north of York Factory. They will have to pass the winter here in crude hovels hastily built against the Arctic freeze, dependent on HBC supplies to survive. 1814, January. Miles MacDonald, fearing shortage of winter food, issues the Pemmican Proclamation, an edict forbidding others to take meat in the form of pemmican out of the district. Since the Northwest Company, NWCO, mortal rival of the Hudson's Bay Company, and therefore of Selkirk's colony, depends on pemmican to feed its bois brûlés, mixed heritage, traders, the edict creates outrage. Though he doesn't know it, MacDonald has just set off what will be called the Pemmican War. 1814, April. From their Churchill refuge, 50 Scots stalwarts of both genders choose to walk across the still-frozen taiga to York Factory to be there for the spring thaw. After a hard 12-day walk, they make it, and presently board the boats that will take them to their new homes at Red River. 1814, mid-June. They reach their destination. They are instantly rapturous at its possibilities, and barely aware of the animosity emanating from the Northwest Company, who want no part of a farming settlement straddling their fur trade route and disrupting trade, not to mention eating their pemmican. They view it as an HBC plot, one they are determined to destroy. 1815. When the winter of 1814-1815 proves even harder than expected, the colonists grow impatient with the short rations and arbitrary rules imposed by MacDonell and his officers. The NWCO take advantage of the rift to offer free passage to Upper Canada for any wishing to leave. Resentment ignites into open revolt, and by mid-June, well over half the colonists have deserted to the NWCO and left the Forks. 1815, June. The Nor'westers now turn their armed wrath on the few who remain, provoking exchanges of musket fire. 3 men are wounded, 1 fatally. Miles MacDonell surrenders himself to the enemy in an attempt to save the colony, but this changes nothing. Leaderless and facing continued threats, the remaining settlers and servants, employees, flee to the safety of HBC posts at the north end of Lake Winnipeg and reconsider their future. 1815, August. An HBC adventurer named Colin Robertson comes to their rescue, rallying them and leading them back to the Forks, where in midsummer there are too few Nor'westers to oppose them. Robertson's experience in the country and his charismatic leadership succeed in restoring the confidence of these loyalists, and when a new governor, Robert Semple, and another contingent of 84 migrants arrive that fall, the colony is back in business. 1816. The Nor'westers are still determined to stop them in their tracks, and through the winter and early spring of 1816 they convince their bois brûlés hunters and traders that their food supply and way of life are at stake unless they gather once more at the Forks in June for an all-out attack. Colin Robertson builds Fort Douglas to withstand whatever force might present itself. He and Governor Semple disagree, Semple believing that his title of governor and his superior breeding should be enough to discourage a few men he dismisses as illiterate buffalo hunters. Robertson, whose respect for the Brûlés' fighting ability, independence, and determination is both greater and in accord with reality, becomes more and more frustrated, finally giving up and leaving the colony in the hopes that on their own the colonial officers can unite to oppose the coming attack. 1816, June 19th. Just 1 week after he leaves, the attacking force arrives on the scene, every bit as formidable as Robertson predicted. Still confident that his authority will prevail, Semple decides to face them. And here our story begins. Part 1. The Earl. Chapter 1. 7 Oaks, June 19th, 1816. Fort Douglas, Red River Settlement. It is June to perfection, a glorious day in Lord Selkirk's Red River Settlement. Most of the people have gathered in and around Fort Douglas. It is a fort in name only. Its defensive wall only covers 3 sides of the cluster of crude buildings that house the colony's governor and officers, the stables, the collective stores, and the 3 cannons that are key to its strength. The rest of the palisade is still just a scatter of logs. 50 settlers and employed men work to finish the fort. With their families, they total more than 100. Only a few have risked going out to their farm plots to tend their young crops. Reports abound of an approaching force of armed and mounted plainsmen, agents of the Northwest Company, whose aim is the final destruction of this colony. While the settlers have muskets and cannons, they are not warriors. They need this fort. Sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock, the alarm is raised by the lookout. A force of 60 or more armed men on horseback is passing to the northwest, heading toward a point on the Red River well north of Fort Douglas. Governor Robert Semple peers through a telescope. No mistaking it. These folks are kitted out for a fight. Conscious of the fort's vulnerability and worried for absent colonists, the governor calls for 20 men to arm themselves and follow him to confront this group. Others clamor to go, but he declines. He is certain that his authority as governor can cow a gang of half-caste ruffians. 26 men leave the fort and strike north on foot. The remainder, under Semple's deputy, Alex McDonnell, stare anxiously after the rapidly disappearing governor with his posse of farmers, laborers, and clerks. Minutes pass. An excruciating hour. Suddenly, a crackle of distant muskets crescendos, then tails into ragged fire for a long minute, then dwindles to single shots, then nothing. The only sound among the watching settlers is their own breathing. More waiting. At last, out of the woods come several men, one wounded, moving as fast as they can into the fort's protection. "We confronted the group," they tell the others, "but things went sideways. The settlers hadn't stood a chance. The few who had run had been shot in the back. Only these men remained." Convinced that an attack on the fort will come any minute, Alex McDonnell has the men take up defensive positions. The day, almost the longest of the year, wears on and finally turns to night. No one sleeps. 5 more survivors straggle in. The 5th, a man who had been taken prisoner, brings news that Governor Semple and 20 other men are dead. He also brings an ultimatum from the enemy camp. They have 5 settler hostages. At dawn, they will kill them. Then they'll attack the fort and slaughter every man, woman, and child. The settlers' only alternative is to give up the fort and leave Red River forever. If they do that, their lives will be spared. The messenger's stories terrify those with families. How long can they defend an open fort? Defeat is inevitable. Reluctantly, Alex McDonnell agrees to surrender in return for safe passage north for all, to the protection of the Hudson's Bay Company. Thus ends the violent day that has come down to us as the Battle of Seven Oaks. As decades pass, it will become synonymous with and inseparable from the story of the Selkirk settlers. Its consequences are still echoing 2 centuries later. But June 19, 1816, is only one day out of the more than 1,000 that are the stuff of this tale, and the gunfight is just the most deadly event in a series of trials, triumphs, and failures that make the story of these 3 years so compelling. Our story truly begins 3 years before, as our band of hopeful pilgrims are about to set foot on North America's shore. Trial and tragedy are already with them. Chapter 2. Arrival. August 18th to September 16th, 1813. Hudson Bay, near Churchill River. On an August afternoon, 2 ships appear off the western shore of Hudson Bay. Both are under full sail and running hard for the Churchill River. They show no signs of slowing as they enter the inshore shallows. Is this a chase? Britain is at war with the U.S., and the second ship is a fighting vessel, perhaps a Yankee privateer? But no, both are flying British colors. Is some terrifying fleet about to heave into sight? But the horizon remains empty, not even an ice floe to break the monotony on this mild, late summer day. Sweeping into the river's wide mouth, the ships glide past a disused stone fort and quickly reduce sail. Along the western bank of the river, Hudson's Bay men, as well as some Dene and Inuit hunters, look up, startled, as this dramatic apparition bears down on them. It's not quiet. Men shout orders, sails are reefed, rigging and spars clatter and creak. The bystanders can only stare.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?